After 10 years, my husband left me homeless. I won the lottery and bought his company. Those words keep echoing in my mind like a mantra, like a prayer, like the sweetest revenge song I've ever heard. But let me tell you how we got here, how those 10 years of devotion crumbled into ash, and how fate handed me the most beautiful weapon I could have ever imagined. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday. I was folding David's shirts, the expensive ones he insisted on buying from that boutique downtown, when I noticed the receipt tucked into the breast pocket. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it, expecting to see the usual dry cleaning charge or maybe lunch with a client. Instead, I found a jewelry store receipt. A $3,000 necklace, purchased 3 days ago. My heart stopped. Not because of the price, David made good money at his consulting firm, but because I hadn't received any jewelry. Not for our anniversary last month. Not for my birthday 6 weeks ago. Nothing. I sat on our bed, the one we'd picked out together when we moved into this house 8 years ago, and felt the world tilt sideways. The receipt crinkled in my shaking hands as I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a surprise for me. Maybe he was planning something special. Maybe. But deep down, in that place where wives know things they don't want to know, I already understood. The next few hours passed in a blur of frantic searching. I went through his dresser drawers, his closet, his briefcase. I found more receipts, restaurant bills from places we'd never been together, hotel charges from the Marriott downtown, credit card statements I'd never seen before, hidden in a folder marked business expenses. My hands shook as I opened our laptop, logging into his email account. The password was still Sarah David 2014. The year we got married, our names combined. The irony made me want to vomit. The emails were all there. Hundreds of them. Love letters to someone named Jessica. Photos that made my stomach turn. Plans for weekend getaways while I thought he was at business conferences. Promises of leaving me, of starting fresh, of building a life together. I found myself on the kitchen floor, laptop beside me, sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe. 10 years. 10 years of making his coffee exactly how he liked it, of supporting his career moves, of putting my own dreams on hold so he could build his consulting business. 10 years of believing in us, in our future, in the life we were building together. The front door opened around 6 that evening. I heard his keys hit the bowl by the entrance, heard him call out my name in that cheerful voice he'd been using lately. The voice I now realized was guilt masquerading as happiness. I stayed in the kitchen, laptop still open, surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal. When he found me there, his face went white. No explanations needed. No denials possible. The truth was laid out like a morgue between us. He didn't even try to lie. Maybe he was relieved. Maybe he'd been waiting for this moment, for the freedom to stop pretending. His words came out in a rush, like he'd been practicing them. He loved her. He wanted to be with her. He was leaving me, tonight. I watched him pack from the doorway of our bedroom, my body numb, my mind struggling to process the speed of it all. 10 years condensed into 2 suitcases and a garment bag. He took his clothes, his laptop, his golf clubs. He left behind our wedding photos, our shared books, our dreams. He left behind me. But the real cruelty came the next morning. I woke up in our empty house thinking maybe I could start over, maybe I could rebuild. That's when I found the letter on the kitchen counter. Legal papers, divorce papers, and underneath them, foreclosure notices. The house was gone. He'd been secretly borrowing against it for months, using the equity to fund his new life with Jessica. The consulting business that I'd helped him start, that I'd worked nights and weekends to support in the early days, was also gone, dissolved, assets liquidated. I had nothing. No job. I'd left my marketing career to help him build his business. No savings. Everything had been tied up in investments he'd controlled. No family. My parents had died 3 years ago, and I'd been so focused on David that I'd let friendships fade. The eviction notice gave me 30 days. I spent those 30 days in a daze, staying in cheap motels, then finally in my car when even that became too expensive. I'd gone from a comfortable suburban life to homelessness in a matter of weeks. The woman who used to plan dinner parties and organize charity events was now washing her hair in gas station bathrooms and sleeping in parking lots. David's lawyer called once, his voice professionally sympathetic, to inform me that the divorce would be finalized in 6 months. Community property laws meant I was entitled to half of nothing. He'd been very thorough in his planning. I thought about calling David, begging him to reconsider, to help me somehow. But pride is a funny thing. Even when you're at rock bottom, even when you're choosing between gas money and food, pride can keep you from crawling back to the person who destroyed you. Instead, I got angry. Real anger. Not the hot flash of betrayal, but cold, calculated fury. I started planning. Not revenge, I wasn't there yet. Just survival. I found a job at a diner, working double shifts for minimum wage plus tips. The manager, a kind woman named Rosa, let me sleep in the storage room for the first week until I saved enough for a studio apartment in the worst part of town. It was a cockroach-infested nightmare, but it was mine. Every morning, I'd wake up on that thin mattress and think about David sleeping in some perfect apartment with Jessica, probably the same apartment I'd unknowingly helped pay for. I'd think about him starting his day with coffee and clean clothes and a woman who believed in their future together, and I'd get angrier. 3 months into my new life, I started buying lottery tickets. Not because I believed in luck. Luck had abandoned me pretty thoroughly, but because it was the only hope I had of ever climbing out of the hole David had thrown me into. $2 every Friday when I got paid. Quick picks because I didn't trust my own judgment anymore. The numbers on November 15th were 7, 23, 31, 44, 52, and the Powerball was 18. I checked my ticket 3 times before I believed it. Then I checked it again. Then I drove to the gas station where I'd bought it and asked the clerk to check it for me. $47 million. I sat in my car in that gas station parking lot and laughed until I cried. Then I cried until I laughed. Then I just sat there numb, holding a piece of paper that had just changed everything. The first thing I did was call a lawyer. Not David's lawyer, my own. Someone who specialized in lottery winnings and asset protection. I wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. The second thing I did was research David's life. It wasn't hard. He was active on social media, proud of his success, eager to show off his new girlfriend and their glamorous lifestyle. He'd started a new consulting firm, bigger than the last one. He had corporate clients, a fancy office downtown, employees who looked up to him. He looked happy, successful, untouchable. I spent weeks learning about his business, his clients, his contracts, his financial structure. I discovered he'd built his new company on a foundation of debt and ambitious projections. He was leveraged to the hilt, dependent on a few key clients for survival. It was beautiful, really. He'd built himself a castle of cards, and I was about to become the wind that knocked it down. The planning phase was intoxicating. I'd come home from my shifts at the diner. I kept working, kept living in that awful apartment because I didn't want anyone to know about the lottery yet, and I'd spread papers across my tiny kitchen table. Financial reports, incorporation documents, client lists. I was studying David's business like a general studying the enemy's defenses. I learned about hostile takeovers, about shell companies, about private equity acquisition strategies. I hired consultants under false names, paying them to analyze his business model and identify weaknesses. I became an expert in corporate warfare, all while serving coffee and eggs to truckers and night shift workers. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was using skills I'd developed in marketing, skills I'd abandoned to support David's career, to destroy the empire he'd built without me. Every late night spent researching acquisition strategies felt like reclaiming pieces of myself I'd lost along the way. I discovered that David's biggest client was a manufacturing company owned by an elderly man who was looking to retire. The contract was worth 60% of David's revenue, and it was up for renewal in 6 months. If he lost that contract, his company would collapse overnight. I bought the manufacturing company. It took 3 months of negotiations, conducted through layers of lawyers and shell corporations, but I acquired it for $12 million. The owner was thrilled to sell to what he thought was a mysterious investment group. David had no idea that his biggest client was now owned by his ex-wife. But I wasn't done. I wanted him to feel the same helplessness I'd felt, the same slow realization that everything he'd built was crumbling. So I waited. I let him operate normally for 2 more months, let him feel secure in his success. Meanwhile, I was quietly acquiring other pieces of his world. I bought the building where his office was located, using another shell company. I invested in his competitors, giving them resources to underbid him on new contracts. I hired away his best employees, offering them salaries he couldn't match. I became his invisible enemy, the shadow destroying his life from the inside out. The first crack appeared when his biggest client, my manufacturing company, announced they were taking their business elsewhere. David's panicked emails to his team, which I read thanks to a disgruntled employee I'd recruited, were frantic. He couldn't understand why they were leaving. The service had been excellent. The relationship had been strong. He never suspected that the decision came from a homeless ex-wife sleeping in a studio apartment across town. 2 weeks later, his lease renewal was denied. My building management company informed him that the space was needed for renovations. He'd have to find new offices within 30 days. Then his second-largest client left, poached by a competitor who'd been able to offer services at below-market rates thanks to my anonymous financial backing. I watched his world crumble from my perch at the diner, scrolling through his increasingly desperate social media posts during my breaks. The confident businessman was becoming frantic, confused, angry. He posted about unfair business practices, about being targeted by competitors, about a run of bad luck that defied explanation. Jessica was getting restless. I could see it in the photos she posted: forced smiles, fewer couple shots, more time spent with friends instead of with David. She'd fallen in love with success, and success was abandoning David as quickly as it had once embraced him. The final blow came when I bought his company outright. He'd been hemorrhaging money for months, desperately trying to keep his business afloat. When a private equity firm, another one of my shell companies, offered to buy him out, to save his employees and honor his existing contracts, he had no choice but to accept. The offer was insultingly low, but it was the only offer he had. He sold for less than half of what his company had been worth 6 months earlier. I let him think he was free, that he could start over, maybe work for his new corporate owners in a consulting capacity. I let him think he'd been saved by strangers who saw value in his work. Then I revealed myself. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, in the conference room of what used to be his company. He was told that the new owners wanted to meet with him to discuss his future role in the organization. I arrived early, sitting at the head of the long conference table, wearing a simple black dress and the pearl necklace my mother had left me, the only jewelry I had left from my old life. When David walked in, his face went through a series of expressions I'll remember for the rest of my life: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally, devastating understanding. I didn't speak immediately. I just sat there watching him process the impossible reality that his homeless ex-wife now owned everything he'd built. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, filled with 10 years of marriage, months of betrayal, and a year of carefully orchestrated revenge. Finally, he found his voice. The words came out strangled, barely audible. He asked how this was possible, how I'd managed to destroy him so completely while he hadn't even known I was in the game. I told him about the lottery ticket, about the months of planning, about the shell companies and strategic acquisitions. I told him about sleeping in my car while he slept in silk sheets, about washing dishes while he wined and dined clients, about building my war chest $1 at a time while he built his empire on borrowed money and stolen dreams. His face went pale as he realized the scope of what I'd done. This wasn't luck or coincidence. This was surgical precision, a dismantling so thorough that he'd been fighting an enemy he couldn't see, losing a war he didn't know he was in. I stood up, smoothing my dress, and walked to the window that overlooked the city. The same city where he'd left me homeless, where I'd fought to survive, where I'd planned his downfall. I told him about the new direction the company would be taking, about the clients he'd lost, about the employees who'd already accepted positions with my other ventures. Then I told him about Jessica. She'd been receiving gifts from a secret admirer for weeks. Flowers, jewelry, tickets to shows. The same kind of attention David had once showered on her when he was courting her away from their marriage. She'd been flattered, curious, eventually intrigued enough to meet her mysterious suitor. He was handsome, successful, and very interested in a beautiful woman who was clearly unhappy with her current relationship. Their coffee dates had become dinner dates. Their dinners had become something more. I'd hired him, of course. An actor who specialized in long-term deceptions, who was very good at making lonely women fall in love with him. Jessica had no idea she was being manipulated, but she was following the same pattern that had once destroyed my marriage. David's phone buzzed during our conversation. A text from Jessica, telling him she was leaving, that she'd found someone who truly appreciated her, that she was sorry but she couldn't stay in a relationship that was going nowhere. I watched him read it, watched his face crumble as he realized he was losing everything in a single morning. His business, his girlfriend, his future, all of it evaporating like morning mist. But I wasn't done. I pulled out a folder, thick with documents, and slid it across the table. His financial records, his tax returns, his business dealings, everything I'd uncovered during my investigation, including some very interesting discrepancies in his client billing practices. The IRS would be very interested in these documents. The State Business Licensing Board would want to investigate the consulting work he'd done without proper certifications. His former clients would be fascinated to learn about the markup schemes he'd been running. I told him he had two choices. He could face the legal consequences of his past actions, or he could accept my offer of employment. The job was simple: night janitor at the diner where I'd worked for the past year. Minimum wage, no benefits, cash under the table. The same kind of work desperate people take when they have no other options. The same kind of desperation I'd lived with for months while he built his perfect life. He tried to argue, tried to negotiate, tried to appeal to whatever mercy he thought I might still have. But I was done with mercy. Mercy was for people who deserved it, who had shown it to others. David had shown me none when he'd left me homeless and helpless. I told him he'd start Monday night. Rosa, the diner manager, would be his boss. She was looking forward to having someone with his education and experience scrubbing floors and cleaning toilets. As I gathered my papers to leave, David asked me why. Why I'd done all this, why I'd gone to such lengths to destroy him, why I couldn't just take my lottery money and disappear. I turned back to him, this man I'd once loved, this stranger who'd shared my bed and my dreams and my trust. I told him about the nights I'd spent in my car, too proud to beg for help, too broken to see a future. I told him about the mornings I'd woken up on that thin mattress, wondering if I'd ever be anything more than a cautionary tale. I told him about the woman I'd had to become to survive his betrayal, and about the woman I'd discovered I could be when I finally fought back. But mostly, I told him about justice. Not the legal kind, but the cosmic kind. The kind that comes when someone who's been knocked down refuses to stay down, when someone who's been written off writes themselves back into the story. I left him sitting in that conference room, in the building that now belonged to me, surrounded by the ashes of everything he'd built. I walked out into the sunlight, feeling lighter than I had in over a year. The next few weeks were a blur of transitions. I moved out of the studio apartment and into a beautiful house in the hills. Nothing flashy, just comfortable and peaceful. I kept my job at the diner for another month, not because I needed the money, but because I needed the closure. Rosa cried when I told her I was leaving, but she understood when I explained about the lottery. I set up a scholarship fund for women starting over after divorce, and another for people trying to rebuild their lives after financial catastrophe. I invested in small businesses, particularly those owned by women who'd been underestimated or overlooked. David started his job at the diner the following Monday. Rosa told me he was quiet, efficient, and punctual. He didn't complain about the work, didn't try to charm his way into easier tasks. He just did what he was told, collected his pay, and left. I wondered if he thought about me while he scrubbed floors, if he remembered the woman who used to fold his shirts and dream about their future together. I wondered if he understood that this wasn't just about revenge, but about balance, about him finally paying a price for the destruction he'd caused. I never saw him again after that day in the conference room. I could have visited the diner, could have watched him work, could have savored the visual proof of his fall. But I didn't need to. The knowledge was enough. 3 months later, I heard through Rosa that he'd moved to another city, probably to start over somewhere no one knew his story. The acting job I'd hired had ended, and Jessica had moved on to another relationship. David was alone, starting from nothing, learning what it meant to rebuild from the ground up. It was everything I'd wanted for him. Not death or permanent misery, but understanding. A chance to learn what it felt like to lose everything, to feel helpless, to depend on the kindness of strangers. A chance to become human again. As I sit here now, in my quiet house with its view of the mountains, I think about the path that brought me here. The betrayal that broke me, the homelessness that taught me strength, the lottery ticket that gave me power, and the revenge that gave me closure. I think about the woman I was before, the one who defined herself through her husband's success, who believed that love meant sacrifice and support meant silence. She was a good woman, but she was also naive. She trusted too easily, forgave too quickly, and lost herself in the process of loving someone else. The woman I am now is different. Harder in some ways, but also more complete. I know what I'm capable of when I'm pushed to my limits. I know the difference between being kind and being weak, between being forgiving and being foolish. I know the value of money, not just as comfort or security, but as power. The power to shape outcomes, to protect yourself, to ensure that the people who hurt you face consequences for their actions. Some people might say I went too far, that my revenge was excessive, that I should have just taken my lottery money and moved on. But those people have never been left homeless by someone they trusted, never had to rebuild their entire identity from nothing, never had to watch their betrayer prosper while they struggled to survive. They don't understand that sometimes justice requires more than moving on. Sometimes it requires moving back with interest. I don't regret what I did. Not the investigation, not the shell companies, not the systematic dismantling of David's life. He made his choices and I made mine. The only difference is that I made mine with full knowledge of the consequences. After 10 years, my husband left me homeless. I won the lottery and bought his company. But more than that, I bought myself back. I reclaimed my power, my identity, my future. I became the author of my own story instead of just a supporting character in someone else's. And in the end, that's worth more than any amount of money. Even $47 million. The morning sun streams through my kitchen window as I make coffee, just one cup, exactly the way I like it. I don't have to accommodate anyone else's preferences anymore. I don't have to fold anyone else's shirts or support anyone else's dreams at the expense of my own. I am free. I am whole. I am victorious. And David? David is learning what it means to start over with nothing, to rebuild from the ground up, to discover who you really are when everything you thought defined you is stripped away. It's a hard lesson, but it's one he needed to learn. And I was the perfect teacher because I'd already graduated from that particular school of hard knocks. The wheel of fortune turns for everyone eventually. Sometimes you're on top, sometimes you're on the bottom. The trick is remembering when you're on top that the wheel is always turning, and when you're on the bottom that your turn is coming. I waited my turn. I earned my turn. And when it came, I was ready. After 10 years, my husband left me homeless. I won the lottery and bought his company. But really, I won something much more valuable than money or revenge. I won myself back. And that, more than anything else, is a victory worth celebrating.